Welcome to JAMA AI Conversations. I'm Dr. Roy Perlis, Editor-in-Chief of JAMA AI and today's host. Our guest is Dr. David Rhew, Global Chief Medical Officer and Vice President of Healthcare at Microsoft and an adjunct professor at Stanford University. David, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Roy, for having me.
So, some shows like this would start with me reciting all of your accomplishments, and of course there are a lot of them, but we have limited time and I want to take kind of a different tact. So my first question is, how do you come to be here? You started out in clinical practice and research and then moved into technology leadership. How did you get from there to here?
Yeah, I'd say definitely not a path that was easy to follow, and I'm not sure how many folks could ever really replicate it, given the fact that many of these were decisions that were made due to a lot of external factors. When I first went into clinical practice, I was fascinated by the fact that there was so much variation in care. I wanted to study it. I wanted to figure out how we could reduce it. And right around that time, evidence-based medicine was becoming much more popular. So I started looking at how we could develop and implement evidence-based guidelines. I had an opportunity when I was a researcher to meet with a gentleman named, actually he was the CEO of Cerner. His name is Neil Patterson. And Neil wanted to understand a bit more about how evidence-based medicine could be incorporated into the electronic health record. And so I created a demo for him. I created something called an evidence-based order set. I showed how it could be developed and integrated into a medical record. And I guess he liked it so much, he hired me. I was part of a small startup that was part of Cedars-Sinai and was acquired. And right around this time was Meaningful Use, the whole HITECH Act. And so this product, which I built specifically for how you improve and standardize care, became a centerpiece for electronic health record go-lives. And that really got me into the whole technology space. And ever since then, it's been learning more about how the technology can be applied to improve health outcomes and to engage patients.
So as someone who's been working with these kinds of tools for a while and having seen the field transition from the kind of AI we grew up with to where we are now with language models, are you ever struck by how quickly things have changed?
Yes, incredible. I actually think within the past 5 years, we've seen so much innovation and it continues to accelerate at a pace that is really hard to stay on top of. And I work for a company, Microsoft, that is on top of a lot of the stuff and helping to develop and work with organizations to launch many of these. But we seem to be moving so fast that even when we develop new things, a later version comes out or a more current and more capabilities. So one of the things I have definitely come to recognize is that a lot of these evaluations and opinions people have about AI, if you ask yourself, when was that opinion formulated? If it was 6 months ago, it may need to be reassessed because it's definitely gotten a lot better.
So if I put you on the spot and say, what have you changed your mind about, right? What's an opinion that you had 6 months ago that changed? Could you come up with something?
Well, I do think that people love to debate whether or not AI could have capabilities much like a human. And I think the bar just keeps on getting raised. A lot of times people say, well, it's got to pass a certain score or a certain test. And when it passes that, then you're like, well, that's not good enough. We're going to have to raise the bar and get a little harder. And it just keeps on getting harder and harder. And now it's passed basically everything that I personally could ever have done individually and probably better than a lot of other physicians. And it's also, demonstrating attributes that are considered more human-like, like empathy. But, many of these things are somewhat formulaic. You'd recognize that, in order to engage with individuals and make them feel that they're trusted, you have to acknowledge their issues and you have to, constantly be aware of what they're saying. And I think that in many ways it helps us understand a bit more about what it takes to be human. And that for me is the most interesting thing. I think we're learning more about our own selves and what is intelligence and what it is like to be a human and a good clinician. And AI hopefully helps us not only in the understanding, but also helps us be better people.
So I wasn't going to go here, but since you opened the door, one of the things I hear from a lot of folks is how annoyed they are by the empathy that is embedded in these language models. When you talk about thinking about being human and what it's like to be human and what it's like to be a physician, these models do a really good job of mimicking empathy.
Yeah.
But it can get really aggravating and feel really false. And I wonder if you've had that sense too.
Yeah, I definitely feel so. And, there's always this feeling that perhaps like I'm having a conversation with a computer. But you know what? The strange thing is, in doing so, in having that conversation and just being able to ask and even be polite as you ask questions, it really does transform your thinking about like what is it that you're using this for. It's really now gone well beyond looking up a specific website to now just having someone or something that can understand what you're talking about and have a conversation and continue that conversation. And that is so unique and so interesting as well. So I'm fascinated by that. I do think that the empathy piece, there is a lot of formulaic elements to it. But if humans did more of that, I think we'd actually treat each other better.
No argument here. I want to talk a little bit about the next generation of docs, the med students and residents and fellows who I think have been among the most enthusiastic in terms of these new technologies. They're also the ones who seem most worried about being replaced by the technologies. What do you tell them? How do you reassure them, or what do you tell them to worry about?
Well, I guess one of the things, whether you're a med student or you're just a person that's trying to figure out how AI is going to impact your future, is that right now there's an opportunity for us to think about all the amazing things it can do. One of which is emulate humans and kind of do certain tasks. But I also think that it also gives us a chance to rethink some of these problems. Many of the solutions that we've come up with were based off of the existing tool sets and skills and capabilities that we had in the past. But if we could envision and re-envision a world where we actually have computers helping us, we could augment our capabilities. And that decision around whether or not you replace or augment really comes down to the task itself. My recommendation is for anyone, whether you're a healthcare leader, whether you're a worker, to think about, is this task a value-added task? Well, in that case, we should augment it. And if it's a non-value added task, then we should probably try to find a way to replace it and use automation. And that, to me, is where I would love people to start thinking about. Now, individually, to be prepared for this, I do think that we have to have a program that allows for skilling and reskilling individuals that can take their own current understanding of how AI works, but augment that through training. And we have this great program, which is called a Promptathon, which I've seen some amazing results, and just teaches people how to ask questions. Because part of the challenge is not just about the basics of AI, but you're going to be interacting with it. You need to know how to ask the right questions, and when you ask the right questions, you get different responses that are far more relevant than simply just using it as a query tool.
So should something like that be part of clinical training at this point, or is this something that we think our next generation should just sort of figure out on the job, so to speak?
No, I think we need to bring in all these concepts that we're starting to realize are so important. First of all, there needs to be a basic curriculum. Teaches people about what the basics of AI are. It's not just an algorithm, but at the same time, it's not this magical box that can do anything and everything. Just teaching people a bit about how it works, the ethics and the responsible elements of AI, and then trying to figure out a bit about how you can actually impact measurement. We don't really spend a whole lot of time about how you measure impact on particular types of outcomes. We assume that AI in itself leads to an outcome, but it really is AI plus implementation that leads to the outcome. And so understanding a bit more about the implementation science. And as you start getting down the path of learning more, then it's time to learn how to use the tools effectively. And that's where the training comes in. So I would say start that early, maybe even before med school, perhaps even in grade school, start learning how to use these tools. And then when you get to med school, refine that in the use cases that clinicians will be used to. And then from there, I think we're going to need to start really thinking about how we can improve the overall workforce. The workforce right now is limited, it's burned out, and it's time for us to use AI to address these challenges.
So you come out of evidence-based medicine, right? And dissemination science. And on some level, do you worry that AI in the clinic is actually going to outstrip our capacity to generate evidence? And the thing that has kept me up at night lately is ambient. The fact that the ambient notes are everywhere. And yet we still don't know a ton about how they might change practice. So as an evidence-based medicine aficionado yourself, does that worry you? Is this a different kind of technology? I mean, how do we study it? How do we prove that it benefits us?
Yeah, so the way I think about it is in terms of the type of data that we have today, how we acquire it, and how the technology is going to allow us to become much better in the future. Right now, a lot of evidence-based medicine is based off of published studies and clinical trials. And as we're well aware, the amount of information that goes through that process to even be presented in that format is very limited. And when clinicians are trying to answer a question, oftentimes we don't leverage the data sets that are available. Like, for instance, if I could say, of all the patients that have this type of condition and that are similar to the patient in front of me, what is their outcome? It's really something that's probably buried within the medical data sets that we have. But we may be able to, with AI, find that information, summarize and present it back to us real time. And that's the power that I see allowing AI to be able to leverage large data sets that are multimodal, diverse, and answering very important questions. Evidence-based medicine may move away from clinical trials to tapping into the power of the data that's available. We oftentimes rely on structured data. Now, we have unstructured forms such as voice, text, image, and video, and all of that could also be now interpreted. And so when you think about what's out there, the amount of data is going to dramatically increase, and our ability to access this and synthesize it and act on it will also be activated through AI. So AI is going to be a huge enabler for us.
So do you think trials of new technologies like this go away or change? Or, what does it look like 5 years from now when we're trying to understand some new AI tool?
Well, I'm hoping that it's not just based on the technology, but as I mentioned before, it's about the technology plus the implementation and the evaluation of that. So I'll give you an example. A lot of times people focus on, the model itself and say the most accurate model is the better model, and that likely leads to the better outcome. Well, I would say that when you're talking about prediction, it may not be the case. And in fact, we have already seen, for instance, things like sepsis models, where if we incorporate variables such as positive blood cultures or positive serum lactate, of course we're going to get a more accurate diagnosis because your person has, they have sepsis. So of course we're predicting it very well. But if I want to predict it 3 days or a week beforehand, well, those variables aren't going to be incorporated into it. So I'm happy with having a model that actually has lower diagnostic performance, so long as it actually has better outcomes associated with it. And what we've seen is that the way that we implement this is oftentimes in terms of a best practice alert that is interrupting a clinician who's super busy, and then they get a few false positives and then they ignore it all. And that doesn't seem to work very well. What we have seen, though, is when a team actually manages these type of information sources that are presented to them and letting them know that this is a person at risk for certain conditions like sepsis, and they follow them up, they actually have better outcomes. And I do think that the team-based approach is where we're heading. The problem is we just don't have enough people. That's why Agentic AI, I think, is going to become a very important component of this, having agents do the tracking and following, and then ultimately having humans coordinate the results and act on them in a timely manner. That's the only way we're going to be able to scale this. We're going to have AI in the form of generative and agentic AI help us in this process.
So I guess this is my cue to ask, since AI people love to argue about this, how do you define agentic AI in your world? What's an agentic AI to you?
Yeah, so the way I think about it is, first of all, at the most basic level, agentic is helping do a task, and it's allowing for a level of automation. But I do think that there's a level of maturity in terms of how we see this. There's at one level an agentic or an agent that does a specific task. And then we start thinking about workflows in which you've got multiple different agents doing different tasks, but they're all interrelated. And then maybe at the next level, you actually have now an orchestration of all of those agents. But in the course of orchestrating, there's a process where humans are interacting with the results. So it's a human-computer interaction and collaboration. And we actually saw this. We have been exploring how this type of agent orchestration can be used for complex tasks, such as tumor boards. If we had more tumor board meetings, we could actually improve the quality and outcomes of lives for so many oncology patients. Less than 1% of oncology patients actually receive a tumor board. Why? It's just very time-consuming and difficult. Now we have agents that can pull the data directly from the medical record. It can summarize the information so that we have an opportunity to understand what has actually been pulled from the record, and it can organize it into a longitudinal timeline. We have an agent that can actually allow us to query and ask questions like, did this patient complete a certain course? All of that would have normally taken a tremendous amount of time and effort, but it's now coordinated. And if you can coordinate that on a platform where you enable collaboration, both synchronous and asynchronous, now you have humans interacting with this in a way that we've never been able to do before. And that's why I think this whole concept of agentic AI in collaboration with humans can actually be a very powerful tool.
So when I talk about AI, I have a slide of a Tesla crashed into a tree. And it reminds me to point out that, it's possible to be too trusting, right? So when you talk about this tumor board, which I think sounds like a fantastic application, but I do get concerned that we'll become too reliant on these things, right? That even in some of my own work, docs start trusting these tools pretty quickly.
Yes.
And they think, well, this knows better than I do. It's telling me something a little weird, but I'm going to go with it.
Yes.
Is that something you worry about?
I do. And I guess I remember a scene in The Office when Dwight was driving the car and GPS told him to go straight. And they're like, you're heading into the lake. He just kept on going.
Exactly.
Well, you know what? I do think we have to remember that the things, they're not always perfect. If you ever had a GPS and it just tells you and you keep on going around in a circle, then you realize, hey, sometimes I do have to override it. Not always, but every once in a while. So I do think that we will learn how to best utilize this. One other thing, when I think about the concept of AI and whether or not it actually makes mistakes, we always have to put it in the context of, I'll call it the baseline. If you had no AI and you were to look at the number of mistakes, that may be sort of your baseline, and it could be pretty good in terms of very few errors. But it may also indicate that you have a lot of problems. And AI, if it's significantly better than the baseline, then that should be the benchmark, as opposed to putting an artificially high level that it'd be very hard for us to achieve, and then say, well, we can't use it, and then go back to our baseline of really bad care or a lot of errors. So I do think that we oftentimes tend to put a very high bar for what we're expecting, but it may not be relative to what we're doing realistic or something that's worthwhile.
I think you make a great point. The assumption is that we never make mistakes, and we do make mistakes in clinical practice.
And there's huge variability, like we said in the very beginning, between clinical practices. So if you can not only provide a high level of reliability or accuracy, but also reliability, so it's just consistency, that democratizes care for so many folks who don't have the ability to do many of the things that we do in certain settings. So, high resource settings have huge advantages, but low resource settings with AI may be able to close that gap.
So we only have another couple minutes, but I want to shift gears a little bit because I wanted to ask you about another area of medicine. I wanted to ask about drug discovery and kind of what your vision is there, because I feel like the fantasy is you take the giant data set, you insert the AI magic, and the cures sort of fall out of the sky. Give me the realistic version of that.
But, this is one area that in speaking with many of the folks that do drug discovery and research, I've really come to appreciate how they do it and why AI could be helpful. There's a lot of information that people are trying to synthesize, whether they're coming from the actual experiments or published literature or even other experiments. And it oftentimes is very time consuming to pull that information and then create a hypothesis. And sometimes your hypothesis is limited based on maybe some of the things that you have seen, or maybe there might be some biases. But what we have seen is that AI can rapidly pull the information. It can synthesize it and generate hypotheses that perhaps maybe a researcher had not even thought of, and allows us to be able to then have an ability to execute on this in a very rapid iteration. And that ability to do these type of tasks has given researchers a new set of capabilities that normally would have taken a lot of time. And we're already seeing that. Some of the research efforts, the discovery time, the ability for us to be able to do things that normally would have taken years are now being synthesized down into days or even months. And so that's the type of stuff that I think we're getting to realize that there's a tremendous power. I think we'll really appreciate that when we start seeing the drugs come on the market and people say, whoa, how did you discover this? And the people go, well, it was really the AI that helped us.
Is this going to be something, though, you alluded to sort of different levels of resources, right? And health systems that have the resources and maybe don't. Is there a risk that this ends up something that big pharma can do, but no one else can? Or do you think these are the sorts of tools that will be able to be disseminated more broadly?
Well, I do think that we're getting to the point where pretty much anyone, anywhere can utilize AI in some form or capacity. So it would not surprise me if a small company is able to make some of the major leaps forward that big companies normally have had. Again, as I said, AI is a great equalizer. It democratizes a lot of these capabilities in ways that small companies or even individuals can take advantage of. One of the things that I think has been really interesting is we oftentimes talk about the amazing capabilities of the AI, but the fact that we put a natural language interface right in front of it so that anyone, anywhere can speak to it in layman's terms, and it presents it back in a way that's understandable. That, to me, is how we democratize AI.
What's the thing you wish someone would hurry up and solve or invent that would really accelerate progress in health? What do we need that doesn't exist yet, but someone needs to invent?
We need a change management tool. I think many people are resistant to change, and that, there's many factors and reasons why, but we do need to make sure that people, one, are aware and understand the true benefits as well as the potential risks, but balance that relative to what we're currently at. I have a feeling that a lot of people right now are afraid that AI is going to take over their jobs, and there's resistance to that. I think that people have concerns about, that it may not be 100% accurate or meet the levels of standards of care that we're used to. But those things, if the more that we continue to look at it and explore, I think we begin to understand that these are actually things that have been and continue to be well addressed. And it's a journey. We're not there completely, but boy, we're making some really great progress. And I can only imagine in the next few years what it's going to be like.
Thanks very much. I'm Dr. Roy Perlis, and I've been speaking with Dr. David Rhew about the evolving landscape of AI in healthcare. You can find links to Dr. Rhew's work in this episode's description. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, visit jamanetworkaudio.com or search for JAMA Network wherever you get your podcasts. This episode was produced by Daniel Morrow at the JAMA Network. Thanks for listening.
This content is protected by copyright by the American Medical Association with all rights reserved, including those for text and data mining, AI training, and similar technologies.